All right, turning now to collaboration in SOLIDWORKS PDM. So just to give you a little quick overview of what PDM is, PDM stands for Product Data Management, and it's essentially a file management system. A few of the key characteristics I want to run through is that PDM is Windows Server based. So it does run off of Windows Server architecture. It runs off of SQL. There's a database driving everything that's happening. And it actually lives inside of Windows File Explorer for the end user. The interface is kind of built right into the ever familiar Windows File Explorer interface. So much unlike the 3D Experience solution that we just saw, which is entirely browser based, PDM does need to live on a server. Now, whether that server is on-prem or it's a cloud server, we're kind of seeing a combination of both these days. All right. PDM allows you to track versions and revisions of files. So by checking out a file and checking it back in, you would be taking ownership over it, making sure no one else can make changes to the file while you make changes to it, and then checking those changes back into the vault saves an extra copy into that centralized archive and makes it visible to others who also work in the same vault as you. You can handle approval workflows by putting files through workflows. You can manage file references, so complex references between CAD files and then also connecting out to non-CAD files. And then you can get into even more capabilities with templates, automation, serialized numbering, and other tasks that kind of just make your life easier in this collaborative sphere. Right. Now, in order to understand how PDM can help when you're working remote, I want to help you understand the checkout and check-in process. Now, this will look different depending on how far this distance is being traveled between the PDM vault and the remote worker. That can certainly impact the speeds, but generally this process is the same whether you are working right there on-prem with the server that's right down the hallway from you in your office, or if the office is 3 hours up the coast. Okay, so what happens is you have files that are stored in your vault. When you perform the checkout operation, the file is transferred, a local copy is made over to your laptop or to your machine. When you have the file checked out, it just lives here, and any incremental changes that you create, that you save to the file, get saved locally into the cache on your drive. When you check in the file, your changes are transferred back across to the PDM vault. Now, where this can make a big difference in a remote work environment is that while, yes, the checkout and check-in operations traveling across the VPN may be slow, you can rest assured that you are working off of a local copy while you are actively modeling in SOLIDWORKS. Whereas if you are using a VPN connection like this without SOLIDWORKS PDM, and you're essentially just remoting into a Windows file share that has no other software controlling how it behaves, you're just connected to a drive. If that connection is dropped or lost, the file, you're at risk for corrupting that file. And additionally, the performance for interacting with that file is going to be significantly slower as your machine has to maintain an active connection back over to that central server. So PDM kind of cleans this up by doing that one-time transfer. You work locally and then transfer back when your changes are complete. Now, depending on where your PDM server, where everything was actually installed and configured, there's kind of different ways that you can think about connecting to it via a VPN. So if your PDM server components are installed on premise in a physical server at the office, then you'll be setting up a point-to-site VPN to the office network so that your computer can act as if it's on the same network as the PDM server. But alternatively, and I'd say more increasingly common, people are, having a lot of success with cloud servers. So then instead of connecting to the office, you're connecting directly to the cloud server itself. So This is, again, more common in kind of a decentralized office environment where there's a lot of, maybe it's fully remote workers or hybrid, and you need something that's going to be able to be connected to largely from away from the office network. Okay. Now, in either of these cases, the user experience is going to be almost identical to what it would be if you were sitting in the company office network, connecting just by being there, right? The only difference you may notice over the VPN would be kind of depending on the latency, the distance that data has to travel. You may start to see some slowdowns, but the user interface and the connection between PDM and SolidWorks is going to be all of the same functionality when you are working in this method. All right. Some other considerations when it comes to working remote with PDM, because not everybody needs to VPN in for full functionality 100% of the time. You may want to utilize Web2. Web2 is kind of a lightweight browser-based viewer client where people who have logins for your vault can log in and just kind of pick through the vault, preview files. They can change a file's state. They can review the file properties or the file connections, but they're not going to be doing any active CAD modeling, because the biggest disadvantage of Web2 is that there's no connection to your desktop CAD. So if you are planning to, open up an assembly and make significant changes in SolidWorks, then the connection to SolidWorks and, the connection between SolidWorks and PDM is going to need to be maintained, whether you're on the same office network or emulating it through a VPN. Okay, but Web2 is really great for the added flexibility it provides if you are running a machine that does not have SolidWorks running. Maybe it doesn't even meet the SolidWorks system requirements. So if you're running a Mac or a tablet, even a phone, you can sign into the browser-based viewer just to kind of, like I said, look through the vault and get some high-level information. Right? There's also work offline mode. And I alluded to this earlier when I said that you can work offline with just SolidWorks, but with PDM, you can also kind of plan ahead of time and check files out that you plan on working on, and then sign into the vault in offline mode. So what this does is it'll take the files that you had checked out, which you've essentially obtained a local copy of, and those files will be stored in your machine's local cache. So then if you take your laptop, on an airplane or somewhere else that doesn't have internet, you can open up SolidWorks and PDM and continue working on the files that you were working on previously. And whatever information that had been cached from your PDM vault, you can go and retrieve that, right? Now, there will be lots of files that if you didn't have them cached, you won't be able to pull a copy of them or retrieve them through the vault without that connection. But this is a really good tool to use when you can plan ahead of time to, kind of grab a copy of the few things that you think you might need. You could even do the get operation on an entire folder so that the entire folder is cached to your local drive. And then when you are away from that vault connection, you have, everything that you need to get your work done. Right? And then when you reinstate that connection back to the vault, whether you return to the office or you turn your VPN back on or whatever it is that allows you to connect out to that PDM server, you can always check your files in to push your changes. And if anybody else made changes to files that you weren't actively editing, but that you were maybe viewing, you can also resync that data to incorporate the changes they made in the meantime. Okay. I also want to touch on vault replication. So this is something that can be set up on the PDM server side, where an additional server is configured to be a secondary or, tertiary or however many hub for your data access. So you can replicate your vault out to a number of locations, and this is typically used to sync data across multiple offices. So let's say your company has an office in New York and in Florida. And those are two distinct buildings where there's, a couple of engineers come into work every day at each. If your primary PDM server lives in the New York office, it would be really painful for all of the Florida workers to have to transfer data back and forth and connect all the way up to the New York office all the time. So instead, what you could do is set up a replicated server in the Florida office that syncs itself back and forth with that New York primary server. And that way, the data in the Florida office between the Florida vault and the Florida users only ever has to travel, right across that same office network. Because you can set up the replication to sync on a scheduled basis, such as, every hour or every couple of hours, so that a file that is generated in New York in the morning is copied over to my Florida server by the afternoon. And then if I go to grab it in the afternoon or the evening, I never had to actually sit through that data transfer from New York to Florida because it happened, on a scheduled basis, kind of in the background by PDM, right? Now, what would happen if, somebody made a change in New York 5 minutes ago and the synchronization isn't set to happen for another 30 minutes and I'm down here in Florida? Well, if I go to retrieve a file that hasn't been synced yet, it'll just trigger an on-demand synchronization. So the background servers are always talking to one another to ensure that I'm getting the latest version of the file, whether it was given to me because the servers synced themselves automatically on some scheduled basis or because I reached out and kind of grabbed it. Now, in terms of working remote, Vault Replication can be a helpful tool where if you have someone who lives closer to the Florida office, their VPN connection to that office may be more reliable and quicker than VPNing up to New York every time they need to check a file out from PDM, right? So kind of adding in that Vault replication, adding in those hubs, then you can add in the extra flexibility for the nearby remote workers. We covered a lot of ground today from some common client environments and how remote workers can connect to different things that they might need in a work from home setup, the different licensing and collaboration tools that are available, and the kind of remote work considerations for each. So I think this was a pretty good review of the state of things when it comes to working remotely on an engineering design team, specifically working with CAD, even more specifically with SOLIDWORKS.